My name is Villafuerte, and I go to Holy Cross Catholic Academy, and this is my application to Team USA Debate. So without further ado, let me begin my speech on team opposition to the motion that the United States has done more good than harm in pursuing its foreign policy objectives in the 21st century. Let me begin. As my favorite American philosopher, Taylor Swift, once put it, "'Cause baby, now we've got bad blood." Now, I know what you're thinking. What does a Taylor Swift song have to do with U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century? Well, where it might not have anything to do with it, I'm here to tell you it paints a pretty good picture of what U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century actually looks like. Not only was there actual bad blood with foreign policy, but as a result of that, many nations have bad blood towards the United States. It is for this reason that team opposition disagrees with the motion that the United States has done more good than harm in pursuing its foreign policy objectives in the 21st century. In support of our position, we offer the following two substantive points. First, the United States foreign policy in the Middle East in general, and second, the United States foreign policy specifically in Iraq. So let's begin with our first substantive point, the United States foreign policy in the Middle East in general. The Middle East has had a plethora of issues that the United States has attempted to resolve, including but not limited to Iran's nuclear crisis, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and serious human rights violations. When we're talking about the Middle East in general, I'm going to talk about primarily these three issues and go in depth because these are rather prevalent and these are pretty recent and also very significant United States foreign policy issues. So first, let's talk about Iran. For the past decade, the United States has attempted to prevent a nuclear Iran. Now, this is problematic because throughout this time, Iran has significantly increased its supply of uranium and other chemicals to produce nuclear weapons, meaning that in the United States' actual efforts to prevent a nuclear state, Iran has actually progressed and is even closer to becoming a nuclear state, meaning that the United States is failing in its efforts. Now, the way in which the United States has been attempting to prevent this nuclear Iran is through sanctions. But throughout history and throughout this crisis with Iran, we've realized that these sanctions have only perpetuated the issue, and it is only angering Iran, forcing Iran to further develop itself into a nuclear state. This is because these sanctions, because it angers them, they're using this as a way to blame the United States to progress in their nuclear state. So ultimately, there's been a lot of hatred and animosity between these two nations. And because of that, there isn't any progress in an actual cooperation and mutual consensus on having an end to this nuclear program in Iran. Currently, Iran blames the U.S. on its pressure for a Zionist lobby for their lack of cooperation. This could be important when we talk about the Israel-Palestine situation, which is what I'm going to talk about now. Since the 40s, the U.S. has supported Israel in all its endeavors. Because of this, it's kind of been a situation where Israel will never actually cooperate with Palestine. To further get involved, there's been fighting over the last century between Palestine and Israel over the Gaza Strip. Now, ultimately, this has been only perpetuated with U.S. efforts because of the fact that these two nations have been violently fighting, and this fighting only seems to be escalating as time progresses. U.S. support for Israel has led to a volatile Hamas and Israel. U.S. efforts have only brought about ceasefire and seem to have done nothing to actually solve the actual root issue in Israel and Palestine. And we're seeing that this actual issue between Israel and Palestine is another reason why the issue in Iran isn't getting any better. Meaning that the more the United States does in the Middle East, the less it's actually accomplishing because of their doing more in the Middle East. Next, I want to talk about Syria. In Syria, there were hundreds of thousands that were dying. Millions left their home as a result of President Assad's radical human rights violations. The U.S. foreign policy was so set on not having any boots on ground and trying to resolve this in a diplomatic notion, but this failed significantly, and it left countries like Russia and other countries to resolve the actual crisis. Now, where the United States tries to paint this pretty picture of Syria as a success story, the Assad regime that President Obama declared dead maintains in power, and roughly half of its territory is held by jihadists. This shows that the United States is painting a pretty picture that their foreign policy in Syria actually accomplished something, but other countries actually solved the issue. And today, what they claim they solved is actually even worse due to ISIL's influence in Syria. And this is going to be talked about even more in my second substantive point. Because while the three failures of foreign policy that I just brought up seem dreadful, none can compare to the US failure in Iraq in the 21st century. This brings us to our second substantive point, that the United States foreign policy in Iraq. The Bush administration maintained that the United States was going to war with Iraq because of Saddam Hussein's link with the Islamic fundamentalist groups responsible for the attacks on 9/11, in addition to Hussein's acquisition of nuclear weapons. The main issue with this war is that Saddam Hussein actually lacked any weapons of mass destruction. He also lacked any serious connection to the Islamic fundamentalist groups that attacked the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and other areas of the United States on September 11th of 2001. This is problematic because, in a sense, the United States went to war for arbitrary reasons. These ambiguous reasons have yet to be resolved, and we're still debating why exactly we were involved in Iraq to begin with, being it that the two reasons the Bush administration claimed we went to war didn't really exist. This lacks practical and ethical justifications for going to war. To make this even worse, this perpetuated two major issues. First, stability in Iraq, and secondly, Islamophobia in the United States. First, the United States had to inevitably remove the troops from Iraq. Where the US believed returning sovereignty to the nation of Iraq was proactive for stability in the Middle East, the reality is that Iraq in 2011 was nowhere near the status of stable or self-reliant. In fact, this unstable Iraq would lead to an inevitable collapse as ISIL would begin its campaign of terror across the Middle East. Many believe that the United States' withdrawal from the nation made it an opportune time for ISIL to take over and secure areas of Iraq. Today it seems that the United States' involvement in Iraq is imminent once again, further proving that US foreign policy in Iraq has been anything short of successful. Second, we're going to see that the United States' involvement in Iraq has perpetuated the illness of Islamophobia. According to a Gallup poll from 2011, it reported that 52% of Americans disrespect Muslims. This statistic is disturbing, especially when we look at the countless attacks against the Muslim community over the past decade. This is problematic because it creates a never-ending cycle of misunderstanding, meaning that this breeds ignorance across the minds of Americans. So long as the disrespect to Muslims continues, Americans will never be able to understand that the Muslims that they frequently harass are not the real enemy. Ultimately, when we look at issues such as the Iran nuclear crisis, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and serious human rights violations, along with US foreign policy in Iraq, we can see that this pretty picture that Taylor Swift for us of "'cause baby now we got bad blood" actually makes quite a bit of sense. So for this reason, Team Opposition is proud to oppose today's motion that the United States has done more good than harm in pursuing its foreign policy objectives in the 21st century. Thank you.